Monday noon lecture. I'm Tess Jones. Happy to invite you all in for lunch and out of the cold and gloom of February. Couple of, I guess actually just one announcement today. On Monday, March 5th, Professor Marjorie Levine Clark from the Department of History on the downtown campus, she's Associate Dean for Diversity Outreach and Initiatives, will be presenting on her latest research, Unemployment in My Practice, Physicians' Perspectives on Unemployment and Health in 1980s Britain. So she's looking at a really interesting and actually really volatile time in Britain in terms of unemployment and poverty, Margaret Thatcher's legacy. So she will be here on Monday, March 5th. Well, sadly, this topic today is actually really relevant. And I'm glad to see you're all here and you're healthy, because we're going to be talking about flu. And I want you to welcome Dr. Richelle Munkhoff. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She has a PhD in English, and she's been on the faculty at Tulane and the University of Colorado Boulder. She is on the Boulder campus currently as Director of Interdisciplinary and Professional Graduate Education. Her research focuses on the history of public health in England from the 16th to 19th centuries, and she works particularly on women who collected cause of death data across that whole period. She has taught numerous courses on the literature of plague, from the Black Death to apocalyptic dystopias. Uplifting topic there. I know she is actually also a Shakespeare scholar and has done some really interesting stuff with Breaking Bad, the series Breaking Bad and Shakespeare. How cool is that? I know, I had to throw that in. Her talk today combines her fascination with plague stories and her interest in health humanities. And she's looking today at Katherine Anne Porter's representation of her own experience of what she designated or represented as plague, and that was the 1918 influenza epidemic. So the title of Richelle's presentation is Plague in Denver, Katherine Anne Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and the 1918 influenza epidemic. Welcome, Richelle. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Gosh, I've never spoken in a round room, so please, if I forget to turn, I really don't mean to put my back to some of you. Thank you for that, for sort of giving the whole spectrum of the things that I have worked on as an academic, and I'm happy to weave those things in questions if you'd like to, because they all have kind of worked together across my career. Am I doing something? I've been very interested in plague from the early modern period, so around 1600, and I've worked both backward and forward, and that's how I got to being interested in plagues like the one that Katherine Anne Porter lived through and then writes about. So I'm happy to talk more broadly about plague and more widely about what it means to represent epidemics especially in the English and American traditions. So talking today because we're at the 100th anniversary of this epidemic, and it's a little bit later in the year, but we're getting in early. We'll talk a little bit about that epidemic in the talk, but that was the impetus for connecting today and opening up this discussion, because this is the main plague story from the 1918 epidemic, and it's set in Denver. So we have to talk about it, even if we're getting in a little bit early. The epidemic is mostly in the fall of that year, not exclusively, but that's the high point. So we're coming in early as we enter 2018, which is amazing that it's 100 years since this epidemic. Katherine Anne Porter, lived through this epidemic here in Denver. She was a reporter on the Rocky Mountain News newspaper, and we'll talk about that. She was only in Denver pretty briefly in her life, but what's interesting about this story is that she didn't write about it until 20 years later, when we're coming up to another outbreak, not of plague, but of war, right? Because this outbreak happens at the very end of the First World War, and she's writing about it just at the beginning of the Second World War. So we're talking about plague today, literally in the sense of influenza, but I think she meant, and we will talk about how there's the four horsemen of the apocalypse and they go together, and one is plague, but another one is war, and how those two fit together to symbolize the end of things. So there aren't very many pictures. Let me just start there. So I spent a long time at the public library down here looking for pictures of Denver in this era. But most of the pictures that you'll see on the screen are other places. I think this is, I want to say St. Louis, but I'm not sure. Anyway, there's not so many pictures as one would hope for. So Katherine Anne Porter, major short story writer, or what she would call novellas or short novels. Most of her famous works are much later than this. Well, they're all later than this epidemic, because she wasn't quite 20, right? She was pretty young during this. Her famous novel is Ship of Fools, and you can see it comes out in '62. So one of the interesting things about this story is that it's looking back, even though it's set in, very much feels like you're in the middle of things. She's writing it a long time later, looking back on the epidemic. So I just want to put a little pin in that as something we can talk about as I go through. And by the way, please raise your hand at any point. I'm happy to stop talking for a minute and listen to a question at any time. I'm deep in this, so it's really super familiar to me, and I'm happy to make a clarification or expand upon something right in the minute if you're interested. Anyway, so Katherine Anne Porter, Southern writer, generally is what she's considered, born in Louisiana, or maybe born in Texas, but considered Texas-Louisiana writer, so a Southern writer, known for short stories and short novellas. This is the story we're going to talk about today, but it was published first as an individual short story in Southern Review in 1938, and then published as a collection of 3 short novels in this book, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, the same title as the story, published in 1939. So you can see this is 20 years after the events of 1918. So there's a long window in which she's processing, thinking about it, saying something, let's say, more than just a recording of the experience as she went through it, right? So it is super autobiographical, but it is not meant to be purely a story of what happened, but commenting more largely, and specifically what I want to argue, and I think she would say, no kidding, she's commenting on the current war, or the current war that's building. So it's set in the end of the First World War, but it's saying something very explicit about the beginning of the Second World War, right? Like, don't do it, don't go there. This is bad. It's only going to be bad. Yeah, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Obviously, the title refers to the apocalypse, right? And the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I will talk about more as we go through, meant to be very catastrophic, right? Allude to catastrophe. So let me tell you a little bit about Katherine Anne Porter. She had a long history of tuberculosis. So in the spring of 1916, she was admitted to the Carlsbad Sanatorium for tuberculosis treatment in Texas, where she spent much of her life, Texas, Louisiana. There, she became friends with a woman, Kitty Berry Crawford, who was one of the first newspaper women in Texas. So this friendship develops, and when Crawford decides to come to Denver for further treatment, favorable climate, etc., I'm sure you know that Colorado's history as a place to come for TB treatment is stellar. So it was a place to come for treatment. She the friend, Crawford, decided to come to Denver, and Porter, although she wasn't as sick as she'd had been, she decides to come out with her friend and be here for the climate, let's say. So she was sick, she was in a sanatorium in Texas, she comes out, she's not as sick and she's not hospitalized or in a sanatorium, but she's here for her health. And she starts working at the Rocky Mountain News, the old Rocky Mountain News, in the fall of 1918. So just as the war is about to end, and just as this major, major epidemic is about to burst onto the scene in Colorado. So she lived at 1510 York Street in Denver, in that building. It was a boarding house at that time. She had just come that summer. By early October, she is ill with the flu, which is when the epidemic began here. So she had a fever of 105 degrees for 9 days, and it was assumed that she would die. So her family came. Her obituary was written up for the newspaper, and the family expected to be taking her body back home. She was given an experimental shot of strychnine. Everyone says this isn't what saved her. You guys can tell me more than I can tell you what that means. But she was given this shot and she recovered miraculously. I don't know, she recovered. She kept her life. It was months of recovery. And she eventually returned to the Rocky Mountain News in 1919. So this window from October through the early months of 1919, she's at death's door and then she's in recovery. She lost her hair. She was in a very bad way for a very long time. This is one of the few things I have from Denver, from this nice book about Denver Health Center, Denver Health's record, early years. So in October 15th basically was the main cut-off day in Denver for what was hopefully not very bad, and then what was suddenly very bad in terms of epidemic for the flu. The 1918 flu is familiar to you, right? Mostly? Really one of the worst epidemics in history. So this is a little headline from the Denver, I want to say I'm not sure which newspaper. So one of these is probably one of those numbers is Katherine Anne Porter. This is the overall mortality rate for this epidemic. This is, so New York, London, Paris, and Berlin, not the Denver numbers, but just to give you a sense of the scope of the, how can I put it, the high rise in mortality in the late 1918, right, October through December, but really October and November of that year, and worldwide pandemic, right? In the US, you can see, I don't think I have a pointer. Denver is, can you see Denver down the list? Am I doing something to make that happen? Yeah, there it is. Thank you. So not so bad maybe, but if you look on the other side, there's 4 columns. And if you look at the farther column, Denver is actually quite bad for this pandemic, right? Given the size and location of it, say, compared to Philadelphia or in New York City, right? Up above in Baltimore. Does that make sense? So poor Katherine Anne Porter, she lives in Texas. She has TB. She moves to Denver for the health of it, as one of the articles says, lands in a massive pandemic. She started her job at the Rocky Mountain News, but she hasn't really, we don't have any articles, or at least no signed articles from that time. Everything that she wrote and that we know she did on the newspaper is all post the epidemic, the pandemic. Couldn't have, well, I guess you could land in a worse spot. You could have gone to Philadelphia or Baltimore, maybe. She's here, but she's not from here. She comes because she's with her friend they're both recovering from TB, right? That they were in that hospital in Texas. So you go out of the frying pan and into the fire, basically. Let's see. This is what she said much later when she was talking about this time of her life, right? It just simply divided my life, cut across it like that, so that everything before was just getting ready. And after that, I was in some strange way altered, ready. It took me a long time to go out and live in the world again. I was really alienated in the pure sense. It was, I think, the fact that I had really had participated in death, that I knew what death was and had almost experienced it. I had what the Christians call the beatific vision, or yeah, and the Greeks called the happy day, the happy vision just before death. Now, if you've had that and survived it, come back from it, you are no longer like other people, and there's no deceiving yourself that you are. So now she is saying this much later. This is from an interview in the 60s. And if you study Katherine Anne Porter at all, you'll learn that she likes to construct fictions around herself as well as on paper. But still, I think there is a truth to this in terms of how she saw herself in relation to the world. She had been across a line and come back, and that it made her different, and it made her see things that you can't see otherwise. Is there anything in that quote that you'd like to pick apart a little bit and talk about? Was she religious? She grew up in a religious family, but she herself, I think, would say no. I think that's why she said what the Christians call, right? Because she's kind of distancing herself from the religious experience, except then she calls her story Pale Horse, Pale Rider, right? Directly referencing Revelation and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So I think she had a fraught relationship with Christianity, is what I would say. But yeah. It's a great question. Is she going to live differently? Certainly that's the narrative she constructs, right? It's hard to tell. So we know she moved to Denver in 1918. She immediately was sick unto death. And then she keeps working for the newspaper, basically as a kind of society reporter. Doesn't seem that deep, if you know what I mean. But then over time, she definitely constructs herself as someone who went through something that made her different. I don't think I think that's true. I mean, it is true. Of course it's true. She's very young, right? I think it gives her a way of, it gave her access to something that I think takes a long time to process. That's how I would put it, right? You go through this near-death experience, and that's what the story is about. I know probably most of you haven't had a chance to read it, but that is the story, and I'll talk about the narrative in a second. But I think she does. It takes her a while to enter that, but I think she does think it's given her access to something. Does that? Yeah. It's religious, I believe. But because she doesn't want to construct herself as a religious person, I mean, I think by what Christians call and what the Greeks call, she's putting her story in a kind of long tradition, and it is a spiritual experience, but not a directly Christian or one single religious experience, if that makes sense. You're no longer like other people. I mean, she's almost close. I think she's interested in the way it might make you like a saint, if that makes sense. Not the way we use saint, like you're totally good and you can't do no wrong, but more like you've been through the fire and come out the other side with some kind of spirituality that may be aligned with a particular religion, or may just be access to something that the rest of us don't have access to, if that makes sense. So that, I think that's what the story itself tries to capture is, well, I think it's threefold what this story does when it comes out in the late 30s. It's both prophetic of, you know, here's where we were and we're here again, right? We were here in 1917, 1918, and oh, it's the late 30s and we're looking forward to yet another war. Let me tell you how that's gonna go. Somebody's gonna win, a lot of people are gonna die, it's gonna change nothing. I think that's her, if you've read the story, the tone is very resigned and very full of, what can it, not quite cynicism, but that sense of darkness that the end of the war, the end of the First World War was an extremely patriotic time, right? For the winners, particularly, for the US particularly. The tone of the story is there is nothing to celebrate and there's nothing won. It is the tone of the story is loss, 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 loss. So even as you're having this victory moment in November 1918, it's what the story doesn't even give you that. I think there's 2 lines on the end of the war. It gives you death, destruction, epidemic, and meaninglessness out of epidemic. So it's very prophetic. I think that's my personal opinion of why it's published in the late 30s, in the sense of, we have been here before, people. We've been here before, and where does it get us? A whole lot of people lost, and not much else, right? So the tone is very elegiac in the story, even though it's taking place in October, November of 1918, when the war is won, supposedly won. But I think one of the things that it's after is there's no winning a war, right? There's surviving a war, there's coming out of a war as victor, but there's no winning. One of the threads throughout the story, if you haven't read it, or if you have, one of the threads there's a running sort of narrative line about victory bonds. She's at a place and these guys who aren't at war are selling these victory bonds, and they're very much putting the pressure on people to buy them even when they can't afford it. And the cynicism of sort of selling the bonds when you yourself can't go to war, as the men who sell them are not at war. The pressure to buy them to show your patriotism, even if you can't afford it, which is the character in the story. The character who's Katherine Anne Porter's figure, her name is Miranda. So a name straight out of Shakespeare. The character of Miranda is in, I'm gonna blank because I'm spacing. The Tempest, thank you. Oh gosh, sorry. Miranda's in The Tempest, and she's a figure for the miraculous survival, I would say, of people during war, and in this case, pestilence. So the name of the character that Katherine Anne Porter gives herself is the miraculous survivor. But the tone that she gives the story is exactly the opposite of that. It would have been better to die than to sort of have to come out of it and think that there's meaning when there's no meaning. So it's definitely an anti-war story set in the First World War, but it's an anti-war story for the Second World War that is coming, if that makes sense. So the story has this strange duplicity to it, in that it's world weary in 2 ways. It's world weary taking place at the end of the First World War, with all the things that you know, the people on the home front are surviving, even as the soldiers are still getting ready to go out. The other main character in the story is her love interest, Miranda's love interest, whose name is Adam. So the symbolism is pretty easy with Adam. And he's Mr. Midwestern, brawny, ready to do his bit, wanting to do it actually. Super healthy American masculinity, that's what he represents. And in the story, it's Miranda, we get it from Miranda's point of view mostly, and it's her story basically takes place much of it in the course of one day, waking up with a fever and sort of the downhill day that it goes. And it intersperses with looks back at previous moments, and then at the end we get I won't call it resolution, we get her succumbing to illness and then surviving it. And throughout her sick day, if you can call it that, her sick day, Adam is this figure of health and vitality, of American manhood, all these fantastic, exactly what you would want American maleness to be in the First World War. Right? As she comes back from the dead, as she says here, and now I just elided the character in the story with the author of the story, but that's one of the things she wants us to do. She wakes up to find out that Adam has died during her illness. So we see her illness enacted through the whole story as she gets more and more ill and then is taken to hospital. And meanwhile, he's American manhood represented in its ideal form. But when she wakes up, he's gone, right? It's both the sort of antithesis of American manhood dying for glory in battle, because he's denied that, right? He's died in a ward with an epidemic, which is it's not glorious, it's not meaningful, it doesn't matter, right? You're one of a huge number. I don't know if I can, you're one of that, right? Your own individuality does not matter. Miranda has to survive that, if that makes sense. She wakes up to realize that she lived and he died, which, by the way, is what she was expecting, right? Because during the whole story, he's getting ready to go off to war, and it's a horrible war, and he's not going to survive it. They talk about that throughout the story, that they kind of have this moment, a little bit like Casablanca or something, where they have this love moment, that's doomed. It's a very doomed story. It feels like everything is doomed, but what you're expecting, because it's a war story, or at least it seems to be a war story, is that the man is doomed and the woman is home on the home front holding down the fort, which is what happens, except that the story flips the meaning. He doesn't die in battle. There's no glory, there's no honor. He's a number, it's meaningless. Does that make sense? It's absolutely without meaning. He hasn't died to protect the US or protect the West, or, you see what I mean? He's died because there's been a flu that's run over the nation, run over the world, and he happens to die. That no glory, no honor. So it flips the story. It's both a plague story, and that's her word as well as mine, but it's also an anti-war story, right? So if this story comes out in the 1938 as a story, and then 1939 as part of that collection in the book, you're sitting there, there's war coming, right? It's on every newspaper headline. There is another war coming, and here's her story telling you, yeah, there's no honor, there's no glory, there's no meaning. You might as well die of the flu, right? For all the massive death that's coming, is as meaningless as death from the flu. Because let's step back for a minute. If influenza has a weird place in the history of plague, if I can just stop on this for a sec. Bubonic plague, bad, no question. Cholera, bad, right? All these diseases that in their very names signal epidemic and, if not a meaningful death, a meaningful presence in the history of disease. Influenza, we have all had influenza, right? It isn't special. As you know, I don't have to tell you, I'm at Anschutz. Obviously, there are individual influenzas which are epidemic quality, right? And are not the same as other flus, but we use the same word for those flus. So I think one of the things that Porter is getting at in the story is the meaningless of disease, but the meaningless of disease at the epidemic scale, when we have a history of putting those diseases, maybe pedestal is too strong of a word, but you know, if we talk about plague or cholera or Ebola or AIDS, we're talking about a very special category of death, right? If we talk about influenza, again, I'm in a room where people have very precise meanings of that word, and you know there's different qualities to that disease. But for the general, for me, right, flu is flu. We've had the flu. Everyone's had the flu, I think. It's not special. It's not in a category up above like those other diseases, right? She's after in this story, I think, something pretty brilliant about epidemics, which is they're not special, even as they are tremendously special. War is not special, even as war is tremendously special, if that makes sense. Plus, war is something we do to each other, whereas disease usually is not something we do to each other, although we, of course, participate in it and can make it worse than it might otherwise be. Let's look at a passage from the novel. Well, what she called short novel. Other people called novella. It's a really long story, and most of it takes place in a single day. So as Miranda is coming down with the flu is the long drawn out, long first part of the narrative, and then there's the kind of sickness in the hospital, and then the brief moment of recovery. So the two quotes that I really want to look at are from that late period. I'm not looking too much at the day that we live with Miranda and Adam as her sickness becomes more evident. But this moment in the hospital when she's kind of, well, we get a lot of, in the story, sort of stream of consciousness, you might call it. We get a lot of being inside Miranda's head while she's sick. And because that doesn't make sense, you know how you are when you're ill? Some parts of the story are very much that kind of free associative or dream quality sense of being ill. So the story starts that way and it almost ends that way. And one of the moments when she's finally in the hospital is these kind of dreamlike sequences. So the drifting circle widened, separated, and each figure was alone, but not solitary. She's kind of seeing relatives who have passed away, people who are not here anymore. Miranda alone, too, questioning nothing, desiring nothing, in the quietude of her ecstasy, stayed where she was, eyes fixed on the overwhelming deep sky, where it was always morning. Lying at ease, arms under her head in the prodigal warmth which flowed evenly from sea and sky and meadow, within touch but not touching the serenely smiling familiar beings about her, Miranda felt without warning a vague tremor of apprehension. some small flick of distrust in her joy. A thin frost touched the edges of this confident tranquility. Something, somebody was missing. She had lost something. She had left something valuable in another country. Oh, what could it be? This comes at a moment where she's giving in to the flu in the narrative, and then she has this little, well, as you can see, I don't know what sticks out to you in those lines. It's very, very beautiful in the story. She's in this other country, right, where sea, sky, and meadow are all together. It's clearly warm, and the people she loves who are dead, we get the sense, are there. So there's this kind of return to love, to caring, to enclosure. She's happy to go there. She's super happy in the story. That's one of the main things about the end of the story, is she wants to be in that meadow, right? But this vague tremor of apprehension, this small flick of distrust, the thin frost edges out, right? Somebody was missing. She had lost something. She had left something valuable in another country. Oh, what could it be? That sense that, well, I don't know what you think about, I don't know if it works without the whole story, I don't know, but that sense that there's something else. And it's Adam to a degree, possibly that's one answer. It might be bigger than that in terms of the story of war and the story of country, let's say, especially something valuable in another country. Right? There's death and then there's not death. This comes later. Am I okay on time? So this is just a few pages later. The hospital, the doctor and the nurse, they know they're losing the patient, and so they risk, let's call it an experimental treatment, and it works, right? The cloth was drawn away. This is the nurse, Miss Tanner. She's filling a hypodermic needle in her methodical, expert way, and she hears Dr. Hildershine, these are the only two medical characters in the story, saying, I think that will do the trick, try another. Miss Tanner plucked firmly at Miranda's arm near the shoulder, and the unbelievable current of agony ran burning through her veins again. She struggled to cry out, saying, let me go, but she heard only incoherent sounds of animal suffering. She saw doctor and nurse glance at each other with the glance of initiates in a mystery, nodding in silence, their eyes alive with knowledgeable pride. They looked briefly at their handiwork and hurried away. This is one of the key moments in the story because the nurse and the doctor are so proud of what they've done. They've retrieved her from death. It goes on in this part of the story. The nurse particularly is so pleased with her handiwork, as it's referred to there. And the patient is so very unhappy with the choices that they've made, right? She doesn't directly accuse the nurse, but why didn't you leave me there? Why didn't you leave me where I was? Especially when she finds out that Adam has not made it through the epidemic. She's very unhappy to have been pulled back from the edge. And it's an interesting story, I would think, for medical students, medical people to think about. You know, they win, they get her back, they overcome death, and she's not happy. The whole last couple pages of the story are, she would have to survive life, is basically how she sees what's happened. They have done this medical miracle in their eyes, and from her perspective, she would have been much happier left alone, left with Adam in the other world once she knows that he's gone, particularly. You know, she's brought back to life only to find out that in the meanwhile, he's passed away. I'm sorry, that's the main spoiler of the story. But so this masculine, muscular soldier figure has died in the interim when we've seen her suffering sort of drawn out across time. And they've brought her back through what they see as medical technology, medical miracle, and she's not thankful, and she does not thank them. Yeah, the knowledgeable pride in that quote, right, where she is the animal in the whole story at this part, right? We can talk about the actual treatment. It's unclear. It probably isn't what worked for her in real life, but that's how she puts it in the story. Their eyes were alive with knowledgeable pride. And I think in a story where the religious echoes, though Porter herself would deny she would deny the religion in her, the religiosity in the story, to give them the eyes of knowledgeable pride is not a good thing, I would say, in her categories of faith, to have that kind of satanic pride in your ability to bring somebody back from the dead. The story definitely condemns the medical work done there, which is, I don't know, something we can talk about more broadly. The story is a strong one against too much pride in what medicine can do. But on the other hand, how would you possibly know what's going on in her head and why she might want to stay where she is? It's given a very, very religious, in that previous, can I go back? Right, this kind of land of green and sky and meadow, this kind of joyous place of afterlife, possibly, or just before death, unclear. This is a glorious place, and to come back to it, to be pulled out of it by this kind of technology of suffering, is what I think she would say. The story is partially about the human in medical control, even as it is also about a past epidemic and a present moment, a past war and a present war to be. Does that make sense? This story is extremely complex in the layers that it's asking the reader to inhabit. So it seems like an easy story about the past. It's also a story about the present when it was published. And it's also a story about those things that are beyond knowledge, right? Religious almost, but more that place between life and death that she's trying to, well, she has access to. And if we go back, yeah. So this event, as she describes it, it simply divided my life, cut across it like that, so that everything before that was just getting ready, and after that was in some way, strange way, altered. It took me a long time to go out and live in the world again. I was really alienated in the pure sense. I think the fact that I had participated in death, that I knew what death was, had almost experienced it. That the story asks us to value death as an experience that's positive in a very, very painful, and I think extremely difficult way, especially if you're trying to save people, right? But that's the story part that it's the most difficult, I think. The better to die. That, I don't know. Anyway, I haven't really mentioned gender, but I think this is also true for Adam in a sense, because he's denied the masculine honor of death in battle. I mean, if he's going to have to die young, to die in the battle that's going to save his country from his perspective would have been so much better than being a number in a plague epidemic, which is what he turns out to be. Right? Doesn't the novella ends very quickly after this moment, not this, the other moment that we were on. You know, basically she picks herself up and she goes on, but it's with a heavy sadness and a sense that saving a life is not necessarily for the patient what the physician believes it is, I think, in the story. But anyway, yeah, 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 she does, yeah, exactly. So it's a great question. He seems very healthy when he comes to her apartment when she's ill, and he's, you know, he's washing her, he's caring for her, and from her perspective, which is the point of view that this most of the story is in, we're then whisked away with her in the ambulance, and we don't see him, but it seems very, well, you can argue it either way, but the story seems to suggest that yes, she's infected him. And so what is your responsibility? I mean, by that time in the story, she is not an agent. She can't move, she can't take care of herself at all. So what does it mean to be an agent in terms of infecting someone else when you're not an agent in the way that we think about ourselves as agents, right? Choosing to do something, choosing not to do something. When we expose other people to disease, we are agents, but not in the way we usually mean it, right? Where we are intentionally or offering up our agency to somebody else. I think that's one of the threads in the story that's very, it's very powerful because you yourself are walking disease, potentially. What is your responsibility toward other people in that question? Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. That's a great question. Whether it's a biological agent in the story or just in general. Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to answer. Not directly, is what I would say. Much more like we are all subject to much greater forces than, I think it's a little more spiritual than that, in my opinion. That we have our world of war and we think we're agents in the world, you know, making war with each other or whatever. But then there's this making its way with us, even as we think we're totally in charge. Is that, I think that's one of the tensions she's very interested in. How much are we pawns to gods? I mean, she comes from a Christian tradition. She's well versed in it. She doesn't inhabit it herself directly, but yeah, how much are we just at God's mercy? And what is our relationship to each other if we're all God's pawns, if that makes sense? But I would say that one of the great things about the story is there's a level above us, which is so far beyond our control. So even if the wars are human and there are these things and we're all agents in that, there's something else beyond. Is that, and we have no control over it. We barely even want to understand it, right? And in terms of medicine, to just come back to the end, You know, if our medicine is all about absolute control of life and death, then we have so not understood our role in things. If that makes, I mean, that, I think that's one thing. She's raising the question. I don't know if she would be firmly at an answer of, we are not totally in control. I don't think she would be, she's definitely doesn't see herself as Christian, even though she comes out of that tradition, if that makes sense. Yeah. Other, yes. Yeah. In Denver. So that's a good question. If I can go back. Yeah. So in the 10 weeks between September and November, which is the high point of that epidemic, you can see Denver has a, yeah, there you go, has that death rate, and then a higher death rate between November and February. And the total there that he's got the arrow at is was where we were. So though in that first column, it's nicely from greatest to least, in that far total column, Denver's place in the epidemic is actually quite a bit worse than many other places. And given its lower population, say next to Philadelphia, right? It's nearly equal with Philadelphia, if you can. So Philadelphia is the top bar, and Denver is the 40th. Anyway, is very bad in Denver, is the short answer. Probably because, as I'm sure you know, lots of people were here for tuberculosis, right? So you have many people who are more compromised already. So when the epidemic hits, let's say it's easier for the epidemic to do well here, right? That, more, go ahead. I don't know at the specific hospital. The overall mortality is there, which is, I mean, I don't know the exact number. I'm sorry, I should know that. It's not a high, how can I put it? It's not like bubonic plague number in that incredible, but it's, I think like all epidemics, it's big in its totality across the nation and indeed across the globe. Is that, so I think if we were here in Denver during the epidemic, it wouldn't feel like the Black Death to us, like 40% of us are gone. You know, it doesn't have that ringing finality that something like the 1348 plague had. What I think is, what astonishes people is the spread, the totality of place where it's occurring. Just around, it's global. It is an absolute global epidemic. Exactly. So those 2 points, that is to say, normally in an epidemic, you're losing the youngest and the oldest, and this one is hitting the prime ages are the people who are dying more than anybody. So in terms of numbers, it is not that bubonic plague scary. What's scary about it is exactly what your point. It's taking out people in their prime, and after a war, which has just taken out men in their prime in tremendous numbers, right? To have that happen in the protected space of the homeland, to use not a good word, the protected, you know, national space where there is no war in North America, taking out people in their prime, and specifically women or soldiers getting ready to go in their prime, I think that's the part that doesn't make sense. But one of the amazing things about this epidemic is, despite that it's up there in the global totality of deaths, it doesn't have, if I say bubonic plague, that means something at some level in everybody's gut. It means bad. It means a lot of people died. It means bad things. If I say influenza, well, I had the flu last week, right? It doesn't carry that baggage, that imaginative baggage that plague or Ebola or AIDS carry. AIDS might be an interesting category of whether it's moved from something more like plague to something less like it in our lifetimes, most of our lifetimes. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yes. Wow. Right. That's a great question. I'll just repeat it in case you couldn't hear. So your great-grandfather, sorry, great-grandfather passed away during the epidemic here in Denver and not admitted to the, wouldn't practice. Right, right. So what's the effect of the discrimination? Yes, of course, absolutely. To be denied care and huge impact. I agree. It's interesting because there's not as much work done on the 1918 epidemic as there is on the bubonic plague, right? Even though it's within recent memory and certainly was within living memory of people who could have studied it, right? It is a kind of, I'm not exactly answering your question, but I would say there's a resistance to looking at it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's not only privileged medicine, it's the war, it's privileged because the death in the war is meaningful. Death by some crazy disease, flu, right, in your house, that's not meaningful. I mean, of course it's meaningful to us and our families, but it's not, let me call it statistically meaningful, epidemically meaningful. If you see, yeah, go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. It's huge. Yeah, definitely more considered, and in the history of epidemics specifically. I mean, of course, AIDS, brought a certain change in the sense of the dead. It's, yeah, right, yeah, right, right. The way that epidemics are researched, talked about, because yes, there's a tremendous racialized history without question. And one of the weird things about epidemics is when you're in it, you're outside of narrative time. I'm just going to put it that way, right? So when an epidemic is going on, you are in a space without beginning, middle, and end. Because when did it start? You don't care about that so much as where are we and where is it going? And because you don't know, there's no way to conceptualize that time. This is also true of natural disasters, if I can just put in a little aside. When culture, when a society, even a town is in the midst of something, I'm sorry, I don't know why I make so much noise. When you can't say beginning, middle, and end, which in an epidemic you can only do when it's over, you can't make sense of it. Is that you literally can't make sense of it. And when you are trying not to make sense of it, is it me? I'm just going to do that. I agree. I think, no, it has a history of silence that continues. Absolutely. And now this, though it's 100 years old, right? So we should have a little more sense. We're only beginning to have a little more sense about it. Absolutely.
Before,
Yeah.
if you would give us a few minutes after if
Oh, yeah.
people have questions, but I want to thank you, Richelle, for, and Pale Horse, Pale Rider actually is available online if you've never read the short story. I think that, you know, your presentation today was intriguing for those who haven't read it. For those of us who have, we can go back and look at it again. But thank you so much for bringing this.
Thank you. Can I just say one more word? If you haven't read Pale Horse, Pale Rider, there's a very strange key moment in the center where the two main characters, Miranda and Adam, start singing a spiritual. And it's appropriation of Black culture. They don't totally know the words, but it's the thing that speaks to them most about what's happening. So I think you would be very intrigued by that moment of what's being borrowed and overwritten by the white characters, definitely. Yeah. Other questions? I see people have to go. Yeah.
You don't go yet.
I won't go.